Yes, so happy news basically. So we're going to look into the version 1.03 of Neo 3 apps template today and are going to talk about a little bit of like how to work with, well, basically output in general in PHP. I recently started tutoring on Wyzant. That's something that actually I enjoy more than I thought I would. So if you're looking for a personal tutoring, like I walk you through your personal needs and whether or not it's in JavaScript, Node, PHP, HTML, CSS, whatever you need for your web dev experience to progress. Be sure to reach out. I'm gonna leave a link down in the comments and down in this info box. And that'll enable you to get a free hour of tutoring. So check it out. I'd be happy to see you there. Now, what are we going to talk about today is a little bit the problem that beginners have, that everything works a little bit inline or the spaghetti code that we have when we start coding procedurally. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. And there's one little rule that we're going to touch today. So we're not going to go into MVC, but basically we're going to prepare for a model view controller separation. And the way we're going to do that is we're basically going to have one file that eventually will grow into something that is conceptually a controller, but for now it's just an index.php file. So first thing we need, of course, is the package itself. So let's start with our composer and say composer require Neon 3 apps template. I hope that that's fast. Oof. There we go. Okay, so if you are not familiar with Composer, like it's pretty easy to install. And basically, what happened now is we created a vendor folder somewhere. Yeah, there we go, and it generated our Composer JSON and our Composer lock. So we can basically now use any kind of package by using the autoload from Composer. So first thing that we're going to do is, instead of the we're going to create an index.php file. Okay, and that is basically what we are going to work off. So as you can see, if I'm here in the root directory, so let's first of all get rid of this, or actually just rename it. And this should basically give us exactly. Now the PHP is executed. That has a lot to do with how my Apache works. So if you're running that, in your Docker or whatever, that's probably nothing you need to worry about. Or if you're using Nginx, then your script should basically point to this index.php. Now, first thing we're going to do is, of course, we are going to require. And I'm going to start with require once because, again, let's get used to this not being one single file, but for now. So I'm going to go into, vendor, and then have the autoload PHP loaded. So this enables me to basically use everything that has is namespaced correctly and autoloaded, therefore, automatically. So because I am kind of lazy when it comes to writing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use those two things. So you don't have to do this. You can also always write the fully qualified namespace, but I always do that so my code is easier to handle. So what we basically want to do is, so we're going to have some code, and whatever we do at the end of the day, we have one single echo, right? So that's also in your framework and whatever you do, like at the end of the day, there is one single echo that is executed, and that kind of forces you to write in a very, very clean way. So this is basically what we want to substitute right now. So this is basically what we're allowed to write, is one single echo. So let's start with how do we nest particular templates. So let's actually first create a template folder. Let's call this templates. And so the next thing that I'm going to do, and this is a requirement that you don't have to do that if you're working with Neon 3, for example, but what I want to do is I happen to know that under the hood, the apps template expects a path to be set, and if that's the case, then I don't have to worry about like how to route to certain things. So I'm just going to say like, okay, this very directory is my path, and that makes it easier when I'm including files, which is something I want to do right now. So first thing I am going to do is I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call this main. Okay. So that's a regular HTML file, and let's just call this title. And here in the body, we're going to say hello world. Okay, so how do we get to this main? So instead of actually, this is just a template. This is not what we want to do. What we want to do in reality is say, okay, so here, we're going to say template embrace from file. And so we can now navigate from the location that we're on. So now we can basically say, okay, that is in templates. And we called it main.html. Okay, so what we should have now, whoops, probably like this. No, we need this, sorry. Yeah. So what we should have now is basically the bare bone output of this main HTML file. So why are we doing this? And this is basically something that we should talk about a little bit more in detail. So the embrace from file function basically takes in a location of the file that we want to render. And here we have an array of parameters. So you notice that we use those curly braces title. So let's go ahead and basically fill this and say, okay, so title is, and I'm going to call this test for now. Okay, so what happens now is that up here you can see that now it says test. So we replaced this accordingly, and this is something that you, as a general markup, is really easy to understand because when you work with front-end code, that's basically a markup you're very familiar with. So that's how you basically go about variables. So the big thing of the big difference between like template engines that are usually used, like Twig, Pug, Smarty, you name it, Blade, is there is no possibility to set variables in the template, because that is kind of pointless. Because as soon as you set variables in the template, you have two problems. One, it becomes either static. If you actually set particular things in there, then you might as well just write it in the markup. Or you have some kind of operations that are not supposed to be in the template. So we want to have a really clean separation. So this is where we do all of our substitutions and variable declarations and so on. So the next thing that we probably wonder about is like, well, why? What if I need like more of a nested scenario, which is exactly what we want right now here, right? So what we want in reality is, well, let's have a couple of slots, right? Let's create a header, and here we're gonna say header, and here we're going to say body, and this has the class body, and here we're going to say footer, and this has the content of footer. Okay, and then here, because I'm lazy, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do this inline quickly, or not inline but in the file, and say our footer is going to be positioned fixed, and is bottom 0 and left 0 write 0. Okay, we're going to see what that means for us. So if I reload it now, then you can see, okay, there's the header, there's the body, and down here is our footer. Okay, so now let's assume that we always have a couple of, let's actually, let's go to get Bootstrap maybe, yep. And just steal a little bit of the boilerplate here. So here we have our CSS. Let's copy that and place that in our head. And I'm not a particular Bootstrap fan, but I mean, it's just like to make you understand that you can basically use anything you want to. So we paste this in. So here is the jQuery stuff. You can place it in the head, but frankly, there are good reasons to not to, and place it at the bottom of the body. And the style sheet, of course, needs to be put into the head. So if we reload this again, we see there's a little bit of a difference here when it comes to the fonts used, but other than that, we cannot really see anything yet. So what's a common thing is, of course, that, well, we probably eventually have something like, so let's call this our structure, right? And so in our structure, we already know that there are a couple of things that we want. So there is our header, and we don't have a header yet. So let's create basically our header template. And instead of using this HTML5 boilerplate, what I'm going to do is I'm just also simply, this is not about, actual content creation. Do you have something like navigation done for me? Navbar. Yeah, let's, perfect. Let's just do that. So this is my header. And here in the index, I then say, and here, this is how I can basically do this. I do exactly the same thing and say, okay, so the header location is templates header.html, and at the moment we don't need it to have anything else. Okay, so if we reload this now, of course what we do now is that we place the structure in here. Okay, and here's our navbar, as you can see. Beautiful. Right? So this is now something that more or less is going to be there for this particular thing. And basically what we now need is, okay, so we have a, did we call that body? I think so. We have a body, and we have a footer. Okay. So the footer, I'm actually just going to leave empty for now. We don't really need that. That was more or less just a to show you. And the body is something that we probably want to have depending on, what we want to show here. So we're not using any framework here, and we're not really doing anything that would go beyond general navigation, and like we don't have a router or anything. So what I'm going to do, I'm in Apache. I'm just going to basically set up a really primitive router in an htaccess file. Okay, so I'm going to turn on my rewrite engine, and then what I need in this case is a rewrite base. So just to have this relative. And here I am running this, as you can see, localhost template video. So that is going to be my base. And I need to tell them that so it makes life easier for me, right? And then I basically say, okay, so, write condition. So next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that should a request file name, should this not be an actual file, okay, then I want to redirect, and that would be the rewrite rule. Here we go. And so a little bit of a regular expression here. So basically say, okay, so it's starts with something, and then actually either or, right, and then end. Actually, we don't need the, let's do it with a trailing slash, it's easier. No, let's do it like this. Right, let's stay clean. Let's stay clean. Actually, no, we don't care. Just wondering, because later on we might want to have like get parameters, but for now we don't really care. And then we call that, I don't know, path, and say, okay, pass that on, and that's basically it. And actually, let's prepare for, yeah, let's prepare for how's that called, query string. Let's prepare for get parameters and stuff like that. Okay, so that should do. And since we are, you know what, we are going to do it like this and say it does have a trailing slash, and in that case we also want to make sure that it is not a folder, so a directory. Okay, so what does this do? This now basically redirects everything to the index PHP. So if I have anything with a trailing slash, then you can see that I mean, this is here twice because I forgot to get rid of this one, but that we basically are on the same page, which basically means that what I can do now is I can have in templates, let's just keep it easy, and I'm going to create another directory that I call pages. And in pages, I am going to create a file that I call home. And here I'm going to basically say hello world. And I'm also going to create a page that I call, how could I potentially call this? Second. And here I say you are on the second page. Okay, so what I do here is basically, this is where I need to get smart. So let's build our little router here and say, okay, I am basically going to read what body is, right? So I'm going to call this body template. And oh yeah, this is something I should basically explain. So we now have a get path. Let's actually do this quickly. So we see what we're talking about here. And we now see basically, okay, cool. There is Sam now. This is what we put in there. That is basically something that we can now read with the path variable. So maybe we should start like this and say switch get path. So what is interesting to know, by the way, is if this is empty, we get null, right? So that's something that you, then it's not set basically. And then we say, okay, so case, and what do we say? Second, all right. Create second, and then we simply gonna say template is, and then we say template pages second HTML. And we already noticed that this doesn't really make sense. So this should be our default case because we basically can be consistent with naming. So I'm just going to define null and say in that case the template is the home, right? So I'm going to actually just copy and paste this one and say home. And then we're going to break, say this rule is over, and then we basically say case default. Sorry, that's not a case. Let's get rid of this. Default. And then we basically say template is, and then let's do it like this, template pages, and then we say get path. Oh, he doesn't like that. Okay, let's do this clean. Ah, come on. Get path and oops, no, dot HTML. Okay. So we basically now have our template designed. So here in the body, we can basically now say, okay, so let's do the template here, right? So what we should have now is if we go here, we should see home, which we don't. Templates, there we go. We should see home. And if we go to secondary, actually let's build a link here quickly and say base secondary, and on second we are going to have a link that says base and what do we call this? Home. Yeah, that should default to home anyway. So it's just base. Okay. Now, as you can see, we don't really have base, right? So the next thing that we want to do is, okay, so what we now have here is we're missing our variables, right? So let's just say we're going to call this variables, and we're going to pass in the same variables everywhere. So here in base, what we are going to do is, and I'm just going to make this hard now because it really doesn't make any sense to make this complicated. I'm just going to say HTTP localhost template video. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to say title is title. Now, you might notice that title is undefined at this point, right? But what we can do is basically here we can say, okay, so oops, title is the get path, and we're just going to say UC first. You know what? We're not going to do that. We're going to look into additional functionality later. And in this case, we're going to say title is home. All right, now let's look at that. Oops, that didn't work. We still have to include it. So our variables is what we're going to pass in. And as you can see, you can actually pass in different variables depending on your need cases. But this should, oops, variables. Why doesn't the title work? Did I not? Where is my? Okay, my bad. The title is placed in the wrong one. Okay, right? So now we can basically see it has the title from the get path. And I should be able to basically say, okay, now I can go to secondary. There we go. Oh, it's called second. I actually made a mistake. It's called second. There we go. Right, so this is how navigation works. And we now basically already created a very, very primitive routing mechanism. So what you probably noticed now is that, okay, so this is our router. This should be its own file, of course. And this is basically then what we would normally place in a controller. So as you can see, what I've basically doing here is I have a overreaching embrace from file that basically takes in the skeleton, right, which is the main. So here we have the actual skeleton of this is how our app's going to look like. So if I make changes on a global base, then they're going to be made here. The header is something that I can now basically include. It's pretty easy to say, well, the header is not always filled. You know, it depends, right? I could, for example, now say, well, I have cases where the header doesn't show up and so on. So what I do in general is to say like, okay, so I can now basically say I'm going to nest this. So this is going to embrace again and basically get to the point where we have the capability of doing this nested. This could go down forever. Now, the huge difference to other template engines would be that you're working with slots, and that basically provides a lot of difficulties. So if, for example, you would here have, you know, like you use particular includes and so on, and then you have to be careful that that's available and you know how that works. And what this template engine does is like, no, you're going to define basically everything that is rendered from outside. So later on, when you have maintainability issues, I don't even have to look at the templates. I mean, I don't. The templates is something that designers worry about. I worry about what I pass in from those templates. Now that said, we decided, right, that we want to have this basically capitalized, and what I want to introduce you to now is a couple of things that we can basically talk about. So let's look at the variables and first of all say, okay, so what kind of things can you do? So let's just say we have something like people, right, that we get from a database in reality, of course, but for now this works, and it's going to be Sam, Tony, and Sarah. Okay, so if I want to basically say, okay, I don't know what the database produces here, how many and so on, I can basically loop through that in the template. So let's just say here I say okay, so, and you might know this from something like you know, JS frameworks, and I'm going to just say, okay, so for people as person, and I should go back to home. Oops. And variables, where was I in home? Oh, it's become, I'm sorry, I'm too used to Vue lately. Okay. So with the N4, I say people as person, and so as you can see, I do not reinvent the wheel here with PHP. So you basically, right, you have this kind of like for key value going for you. So you write this just as you would write PHP. You just don't need the dollar signs. So I could basically say, you know, okay, key, right? And then I would basically see, okay, this is how it's interpreted. Now, there are, however, a couple of things that I need to make sure of when I could, for example, say, we're going to make this a little bit more complicated and say, like, we want to filter on particular things. So let's actually make this different and say, nope. So in reality, they all have a name. And the name, first name was Sam, right? And they also have a gender. And our gender in that case would be male, right? And then we set Tony, and then we set Sarah. Oops, Sarah. So Sarah is now female, right? So if I want to create a filter and say like, well, so I mean, first of all, this will not run anymore, right? So actually, let's look at this a little bit different and split this vertically. So I'm now basically iterating through complete arrays. So how do I get there? Let's actually get rid of this to confusion. So what I can do is I can basically always go in here and say, okay, give me the name, right? Because now this iterates and I've got this whole array. So in order to go deep there, I can say person.name. That's also markup you should be pretty familiar with. And as you can see, this works nicely now. There's no change to that. So, but I want to have a condition now and say, well, I only want to filter on female people, right? So I'm just going to add an if and say if person.gender is, oh, actually, this is going to be interesting. This is going to be very interesting, but let's try it out. Okay, so only female, we said. So this is now something where you have to think a little bit. Now, if I run this, I get my Sarah, right? And so what this does is this, and if automatically understands the type. So this compares basically on a string basis, right? So this works with string f. You're also pretty familiar with that. It's almost like you would work in a front-end framework. So now I can basically say, okay, this is now type conscious, and basically, yes, it has the string f is person gender. So now it basically does exactly what we want. Now, the thing that we also want to do, though, is let's say we want to now basically work with this a little bit, right? So let's, for example, say everybody that has a gender M is supposed to be called Mr., and everybody who has a gender F is supposed to be called Mrs. So how do I achieve that? Of course, I mean, what I could do, right, is I could, of course, do something like this and basically say span and then if, and then person gender is F, then Mrs., and if M, then Mr., right? So that will work. Let's get rid of our condition here. That would work, of course, right? So now I basically have this, done like that. And that's probably also a way, I mean, a very, very readable way of how to treat that. But just to show you what you can do, if there's functionality that goes beyond what you have in this template engine, you can also define basically a closure in order to do that. So let's actually create our functions here and say, okay, so the template functions register closure, and I'm going to call this title. No. Create or address. No. How do you call this? Yeah, I'm going to call it create title. It's a little bit confusing, but why not? And then I'm going to create a function, and the function takes in the input. And oops, sorry, 2JS style here. And so what I want to do is basically I'm going to give this function something that I expect to be in a particular format. So in that case, that it has a gender, right? And then I basically say return, and then I say input gender is M, then Mr., else Mrs. Okay, so what I can do now is basically say, okay, so instead of this, let's call a function here, and we call the function create title. Create title, and we're going to put in we'll iterate over. So in that case, person. And let's see what that gives us. Well, now naturally we see no difference whatsoever, but I mean, that's what was expected. Let's actually, so we can see, just going to add a hyphen here, just so we see that it's working. You know what I mean? I don't want to confuse you. And you can see, okay, now basically this function is something that I can use in the templating system. So what's the huge advantage of that is that you can basically have all kinds of particular things that you need. So let's, for example, say we're actually gonna do this differently and say first, let's call this first, and then there's going to be a last, and last is maybe, I mean, again, I don't know how you get this out of a database, so let's just assume that that's the format, and we're going to call this atoms, right? And I'm going to insert that actually everywhere. And this is, I don't know, Walter, and this is maybe Smith, okay? So what happens now is, of course, that so the declaration will still work, but the person name doesn't exist anymore, right? That's interesting to know that if something like that happens, the template engine will not automatically get rid of that, right? That's a setting you could take, but more importantly, you sometimes have this interesting fact where there's information that you already know and you can render it, but sometimes you want your front-end framework to pick up on it and react on it accordingly, right? So to now, for example, I don't know, render an input field or whatever. So that's why if this is not set, it will still show you, okay, this is what's left here, right? So you can react on it accordingly. So basically that doesn't work. So what we want to do is we're going to create another template function. And actually, since we're giving this all in, we could actually, you know what, we're just going to add to that one. And make this a little bit ugly, but let's put this one together. And then say, okay, input last, and give it a comma, space, and input first. And we maybe should then say create title. Yeah, okay, let's leave it. And then we get rid of that one. So what happens now is that we basically say, okay, now we can work with the input as we want, and can basically therefore take care of particular necessities that would otherwise be hard to achieve. And actually, now that I see it, this is a little bit OCD, but what really bothers me is the missing space here. There we go. Yeah, so far for the introduction of adding functionality. More importantly, though, what we have achieved now is we can basically now write applications, right? And start working with that. I wouldn't recommend to build an application like that, but as you can see, it works. So in less of 50 lines of code, we basically have achieved basic routing and templating without being too complex of any sort. So that's basically what I wanted you to show. I hope you enjoy. There's a couple of other things. So what you will also find down in the info box to this video is a link to the the package, to the whole documentation and so on. And I'd be really interested in what you built with it. Please get back to me. I'm actually really missing out on comments sometimes. So I get, like on particular videos, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever. I don't have that many viewers, so, that's understandable, but it would be very nice, to get some feedback on, well, how how you are or what you're doing with that, because I know that I've got a lot of visitors from India, and I know then that they download the packages and so on. So I'd be interested to basically get a little bit of a feedback of what's going on. Is there anything I can do to help you out? Let me know. Well, thank you so much for watching, and again, I know this was a very fast walkthrough, so I expect you to be able to do some basic operations here, but I hope that it helped you out, and see you at the next video, I suppose. Thank you so much.